In 1969, Led Zeppelin released their punishingly heavy blues album, whilst Deep Purple, just 6 months later, referenced a more feral British rock sound. But which is better? 1969 was a pivotal year for the burgeoning heavy metal scene, with Earth changing their name to Black Sabbath and then releasing their debut album, their groundbreaking debut album in 1970, an album loathed by Lester Bangs. But Led Zeppelin upped the heaviness of the new Yardbirds and released their debut album, the wonderful Led Zeppelin, or known as Led Zeppelin 1. This was a weighty, bludgeoning appropriation of the blues, very much drawing from the picking up the baton from Cream and the Jimi Hendrix Experience, although Led Zeppelin were more focused on power and performance, leaving behind all the pop melodies and frilly shirted nonsense of the psychedelic era. Also in '69, Deep Purple had moved away from vanilla fudge wannabes to mining a more explosive, hard British sound, and less transatlantic and not so much defined by the baroque croonings of Rod Evans. They brought over from episode 6 Ian Gillan, of course, fresh from the Sermon on the Mount, whose glass-worrying shriek changed the dynamics and sound of this band, also accompanied by the ever-reliable Roger Glover. I'm of course talking about this album, the iconic Deep Purple in rock. Now, according to Wikipedia, Blackmore said he wanted to have a go at being really heavy after hearing the Led Zeppelin debut. I always consider this to be their kind of debut album. It's the debut album of the Mark II lineup, not including their dalliances with orchestras, of course. But this is where Deep Purple become Deep Purple, as far as I'm concerned. And at the time, they were using the same rehearsal space of another young British rock band called Spice, later to be dubbed Uriah Heep. Deep Purple released In Rock in April 1970, 6 months after the wonderful Led Zeppelin debut. Led Zeppelin was certainly making their mark in the USA with their powerful priapic performances, dampening a generation of young women, and less said about the Mudshark, the better. I think it's in the Lemon song, which is of course on the next album, where Robert Plant sings "Squeeze my lemon until the juice runs down my leg." Of course, Robert Plant here is actually referencing a British music hall standard called The Grocer's Lament, which went something like, you can squeeze my lemon, but please don't touch my plums. I think there is a recording of Zeppelin actually covering this somewhere in the can. So, Led Zeppelin's debut or Deep Purple in rock? Which is the better album? After John Lord's Concerto for Group and Orchestra, the band get down to making the first proper Mark II Deep Purple album. This album is a manifesto of British hard rock, as far as I'm concerned. It's a sonic blueprint which would haunt this band for the rest of their career and have fans frothing away whenever they deviated from it. Famously, of course, the second album does just that, Fireball, an album that's not loved by Ritchie Blackmore. And their later dalliances with the blues would have Blackmore dismiss their sound as shoeshine music. But I love that feral cacophony of sound that Purple make at this juncture, with that Hammond C3 fed through those stacks of Leslie speakers. That sound is unearthly, especially when you get John Lord's organ jousting with the guitar pyrotechnics of Ritchie Blackmore. My word, what a din they created, and Speed King, that's a seriously heavy number for its time. But the sound on this album is sometimes too distorted, perhaps. I don't know, that's not Martin Birch's fault. Apparently that was the band constantly wanting to push the levels up. On an album where Bloodsucker has been described as an opportunity for the listener to catch their breath, is a powerful album indeed. And that's before launching into the progressive epic that is Child in Time. Of course, parts of this number are somewhat appropriated from A Beautiful Day's 1969 song Bombay Calling. Ian Gillan mesmerises the listener in a series of hypnotic crescendos, bookending perhaps one of the best instrumentals in hard rock. Side 2, of course, opens with those searing power chords of Flight of the Rat, a pun on Korsakov's Flight of the Bumblebee. Then we get into the Fire and Living Wreck, finally finishing with Hard Loving Man, the album descending to a squall of feedback. Interestingly, Lester Bangs said he was always looking for that flashbulb moment in rock. Perhaps this is it. Led Zeppelin 1 had a very distinctive sound from the get-go, with the album defined by this band's influences. This album takes the heavy impressionistic blues of the Jimi Hendrix Experience and Cream and takes it up a notch. It coshes the listener mercilessly, aided of course by the powerhouse drumming of John Bonham. Led Zeppelin created a majestic and seismic rendering of this music which, according to Steve Irwin, was a significant turning point in the evolution of hard rock and heavy metal. We are greeted to a salvo of guitar riffs, lumbering psychedelic heavy rhythms, and all those tight-trousered orgasmic vocals from Plant. But their music wasn't just an onslaught of feedback, squall or heaviness. Their music had nuance and texture, with varying tempos and an intriguing dynamic range to it all. Tracks like Dazed and Confused, You Shook Me and I Can't Quit You Babe announced themselves decisively on this record. But I can't help but feel the remainder of the album, especially tracks like Babe, I'm Going to Leave You, is kind of a foreshadowing of where this band were going to go as they headed towards Middle-earth. We get the gorgeous shuffles of Good Times, Bad Times, and the whimsical English folk of Black Mountain Side. Well, it should be kind of whimsical folk, as the intro was pinched from Bert Jansch. And Communication Breakdown, what a frenzied number that is. A number that anticipates the punk explosion in terms of its attitude and vibe. Deep Purple were a pretty inconsistent band in terms of quality. They suffered from appalling management, I think, and personnel issues, whereas Zeppelin were much more consistent. Probably having the likes of Peter Grant in their corner helped them. But they were a bit of an enigma, which for many is part of their appeal. They were hugely popular from 1969 to 1980, but critical respect seemed to be somewhat lacking. Rolling Stone magazine panned them, which is kind of a badge of honour if you ask me, and they never quite hit it off with the music intelligentsia. The production on Led Zeppelin 1 is absolutely fabulous, so hat off to Jimmy Page for that. Whereas the production on the first Deep Purple album, the In Rock album I should say, I think the production harkens back to a sound more reminiscent of the time and therefore now dates it a little bit. My preference is for In Rock. It feels more feral, more dangerous. It's explosive and threatens to, almost refuses to be constrained by the vinyl that contains this music. Also, it has to be said, I enjoy the more progressive elements in Deep Purple's music, especially explored on this record. I would hold up Speaking, Fly to the Rat and Child in Time as a wonderful example of a hard, bludgeoning rock with progressive leanings that seized my imagination. So there you are, Deep Purple's In Rock would be my choice in this competition. I'd love to know your opinion. Please leave your comments below. Please do click like, subscribe and check that notification bell. It all helps the channel, it feeds the algorithm. Anyway, I will leave you with my closing catchphrase, which is I hope you're well, staying safe, but more importantly of course is that you keep listening.